Shoto Todoroki is among one of the strongest characters in My Hero Academia, and I started thinking, why is that? Until it hit me in 2 seconds, and it was the realization that the dude literally has 2 quirk, half ice, half fire. And the more I stopped to think about that, I just think those are pretty basic quirks. It's insane to think how strong he got. So I figured, let's give Deku a half and half quirk. And as I started thinking of ideas of what to give him, it finally hit me. Lightning and water, the perfect combination for a storm, which is exactly what Deku's quirk is going to be called in this video. So ladies and gentlemen, if you guys go on to like my idea of a half and half quirk that I gave to Deku, then smash the like button, seeing as it does help your boy keep the lights on in the house. But with no further ado, enjoy.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
Begin our story with the birth of a young Izuku. With the moment that Izuku would be born, he would come out with 2-tone hair, kind of similar to Todoroki due to the fact that he is going to be having a half and half quirk. And I haven't really decided whether it's going to be white and turquoise or like a gold and turquoise type of color, similar to how Kaminari's hair is, where lightning is yellow and stuff like that, and then obviously water is like more of a blue color. I was thinking I could go with that kind of combo, but I still haven't decided because the thumbnail still hasn't been made. But once you guys see it, you guys will know what it looks like. Anyways, that's not the point. Point is that Izuku in this timeline will kind of have been born into a bit of a quirk marriage, because interestingly enough, in this timeline, I would like Inko not to be born with her telekinesis quirk, but instead to actually possess a water quirk, a very, very weak one at that, which would essentially give her the ability to manipulate water molecules to a very limited amount. And Izuku's father would have a lightning quirk, being a pro hero, not really a very recognizable one, but one nonetheless, who has a decent lightning quirk, about at the level of Kaminari. So with that said, Izuku would be born with a quirk by the name of half water, half lightning. However, the first time that Izuku would make his way to the quirk doctor, thanks to the quirk not fully having manifested yet and still growing within Izuku, Izuku's quirk would be titled Thunderstorm, since it essentially gives Izuku the ability to control, well, thunderstorms, resulting in lightning and water, not really being looked at as a half and half element, but more so looked at as one combined quirk. So with that said, Izuku would be told that he has a pretty interesting quirk and that there might be a chance he could be a hero if he works really, really hard with that quirk. Izuku would smile at the thought of somebody reassuring Izuku that he could become a hero. So after this would happen, Izuku would most likely go to class where he would tell everybody about the news that not only does he have a quirk, but he actually has a pretty interesting one with a really cool name, Thunderstorm. Katsuki hearing this would not exactly like that, because in his ears he's thinking that this means that Deku probably thinks he's on his level. So Bakugo, having his crazy god complex, would most likely attempt to put Deku down, and this would result in bullying, with Izuku in this timeline being more wise than he would be in the original and a little less kind-hearted, realize that Bakugo, or Katsuki, is, well, fake. Once he would realize this, he would completely stop trying to hang around Katsuki, completely ignoring the kid, with Bakugo enjoying this, and still poking fun at the young man whenever the opportunity presented itself. So with that being said, and as the years would pass, Izuku would train his relatively weak quirk at the moment, and every single day, Izuku would do this training by essentially manipulating his quirk to a very small degree at every single moment of the day. If you guys have seen Dragon Ball, remember how Goku and Gohan came out of the time chamber and they were in the Super Saiyan transformation at all times, treating it as though it was their base state? This helped them train and get accumulated to using this, or Demon Slayer, where they use total concentration breathing and they do it at all times. That's what Izuku would be doing with his quirk, having it active at all times near his hand. This would allow Izuku a level of control over his quirk, which would be incredibly impressive, with Izuku constantly channeling storm particles via water, creating lightning particles that constantly crackle around his fingers at such a light amount that nobody could even notice them. And the only times that Izuku wouldn't do this would be when he was in the shower because of fear of the water being conductive, and when Izuku was using the bathroom because he had to concentrate a bit more for that, you know what I mean? So safe to say, Izuku would be very powerful by the time he gets to middle school. And with him now entering 6th grade, on the first day of class, Izuku would walk inside with a new feeling of confidence, to which Bakugo, quickly noticing, retaliates by making sure that he can put the brat down. And so, rushing towards the direction of Izuku to try to bully him, he would start making snarky remarks at the boy, telling him that he and his weak Quirk are so damn lame, he can't believe that the boy's acting with this kind of bravado. Izuku, hearing that, would simply tell Bakugo to go away, with no hint of fear in his eyes or even his body language. This would piss Bakugo off, who would now go even harder at the kid, going, "Whoa, looks like you finally grew a pair, Izuku, but it's not like you're gonna be able to do anything against my explosions. Now," grabbing his shirt, "how's about you get me and my buddy some food? We're starving." Izuku, hearing this, would tell Bakugo to let him go, that this is his last chance. But Bakugo, obviously not doing this, thinking himself to be the alpha in this situation, alpha, would proceed to continue on with the bullying, to which Izuku would proceed to absolutely embarrass this man. So with Bakugo still holding on to Izuku and being in such close range that all Izuku had to do was divert that electricity to Bakugo, that's exactly what he would do, stunning the boy and causing his hair to go up to split ends. This would piss the boy off royally, as everybody would laugh at him and Izuku would simply walk off, not thinking that he had to do more to Bakugo. However, Bakugo wouldn't let this slide and would continue his insistent bullying, forcing Izuku to think that it might just be better for him to swap schools. So going over to his mom and telling her about this and saying he doesn't exactly feel like fighting him, she would agree, saying that she'll change him schools immediately. So that same day, right before the school would close, she would go to the door, prying it open practically as the woman would be about to close it, and say that she wants her son to be pulled out of the school immediately, transferred to the nearest school. They would tell her that unfortunately that school doesn't offer a bus system, so Izuku's gonna have to be driven there every single day. But Inko, caring about Izuku and not wanting him to have problems with Katsuki, would simply agree, saying that she'll do that. So the paperwork would be filed and Izuku would transfer schools. After this, life would begin to change with Izuku, and he would grow more and more confident by the days, with people thinking of his quirk as being really cool, and finally seeing Izuku for himself, not as Bakugo's punching bag or someone that you have to stay away from or else Bakugo will come after you. Izuku finally was free to form his life, so that social anxiety and that fear of talking to girls completely disappears. And before you know it, Izuku finds himself at the gates of UA about to take the entrance exam. This is when we would watch Izuku walk inside, and on his way there, he would accidentally bump into a girl with brown hair, having been dozing off, thinking about how cool it would be to be a pro hero. He would apologize as the girl would say, "Oh, it's okay. Isn't it nerve-wracking? We're gonna go take a test that'll determine the rest of our lives." Izuku would conversate with her for a second before wishing her luck, and she would do the same as the two would enter the area and proceed to take the test. This time, because Izuku and Bakugo don't attend the same schools, they don't sit next to each other, and Izuku's far enough from Ida that his rambling, which still happens, it doesn't cause a problem for the boy. So with that said, Izuku makes his way towards the mock battle testing area, and once there, Izuku would simply patiently wait for the test to begin, only for a few minutes to pass, and Izuku to rush in alongside everybody else. However, due to the fact that Izuku at this point still hasn't developed a way to move himself, or move faster technically with his quirk, much similar to how Todoroki does by using his ice to, pretty much just slide places, Izuku can only rely on his running, and though he is decently fast, it's nothing to write home about. So as Izuku would encounter his first robot, Izuku would shoot a finger pistol of lightning towards it with perfect accuracy, because Izuku could use his lightning as an extension of his own body, having practically used it every single second of the day since he was about 5 years old and discovered that training technique. So with that said, Izuku would proceed to shut down the robot immediately with the perfect amount of charge that he needed in order to cause it not to explode but to merely just turn off. He would go on to do this to the remaining couple of other robots that he would be lucky enough to find, and eventually this is when suddenly Izuku can hear the ground rumble, with him thinking to himself that this is his chance to show everybody that he can not only handle things in an efficient way, but in a flashy one. So seeing the 0-pointer robot before Uraraka could even get captured, Izuku from his mouth would shoot out a roar. However, it wasn't really coming from his mouth, he simply did this for dramatic effect. The energy simply traveled through his hand and out his mouth, though it wasn't actually generated from there. This blast of energy would turn into that of like a weird lightning falcon that proceeds to destroy the robot, leaving an explosion, which Deku would simply say, boom. After this would happen, Izuku would walk off in search of more robots, destroying 2 more before the test would finally be over, and everybody would stare at Izuku, thinking that that kid is a monster. A few days after this would take place, Izuku would now find himself face first with a gigantic door of Class 1A, and entering it before taking a deep breath, Izuku would walk inside hopeful to meet his new classmates. However, this is when, to Izuku's dissatisfaction, he would see Bakugo sitting towards the front of the class, arguing with Tensei Ida. Izuku in this moment would nearly wish that he could switch classes, but suddenly, a red-haired boy named Kirishima would go over to him saying, "Whoa, you're that guy from the entrance exam, huh? I heard rumors about you. A half and half-haired kid that destroyed a robot with his mouth? That's insane, dude. How did you manage that?" Izuku, then getting the praise from everybody else, would think that maybe this class isn't so bad, and eventually as Izuku would sit down, Aizawa would pop up out of his little sleeping bag, going on to tell everybody what's gonna happen, explaining the rules of the test and how the person in last place will fail. Suddenly everybody else would go on and take every single event, and you all know the drill, with Izuku performing pretty damn well, doing very well with the ball throw and pretty decent with the other tests, meaning that by the end of everything, Izuku would rank among the top 6, which is pretty cool, even though he does end up losing to Katsuki. Izuku, noting that he was definitely gloating about that in his head, since Bakugo was already staring at him, practically saying, "Huh, I beat you, Deku." Izuku would simply walk past him before remarking, "Just because you beat me at this exam doesn't mean you'd beat me in a fight." To which Bakugo would reply, "The hell you just say to me, you half-and-half bastard?" With Aizawa taking note of this and binding him, saying that if he wants to start fights with this young boy, that he better leave UA, because this school has no time for delinquents. And with Bakugo sneering under his breath, "Fine, fine," Aizawa would let him go. After Izuku would watch Katsuki get reprimanded, he would proceed to have a little bit of a cheeky smile on his face, with him looking towards Bakugo and sticking out his tongue a bit when the teacher wasn't looking. This would garner a rage-filled Bakugo to practically start literally boiling from rage. As the day would finally end, and once class would finally be over, Izuku would make his way home. However, on his way there, this is when Bakugo would confront Deku, going on to ask Izuku what the heck his deal was. This would garner a laugh from Izuku, with him chuckling, reminiscing about what had happened in class, as Bakugo would get more and more angry at the sight of seeing Izuku laughing at him. This would piss him off so much, and as the boy would raise his hands ready to fight, Izuku would remind him that they can't exactly be taking part in that, unless the both want to be expelled. But since Izuku won't retaliate and he'll be the one with injuries to prove that Bakugo did it, he assumes that he wouldn't really mind getting expelled for this petty grudge, now would he? To which Bakugo, gritting his teeth, would simply say that he got lucky, but the next time that they have a chance to fight, he'll slaughter him. He swears it, before walking away angrily, as Izuku would simply sigh in his head, thinking that he hopes Bakugo finally got the message, since the only reason he had done that was to try to teach Bakugo what it was like to be on the other end of things. But when the next day would start and Izuku would find himself sitting next to Bakugo, or not next to, but like, a little bit away, Bakugo would just stare daggers at Izuku, ready to practically launch an explosion at him at any given moment, at this point uncaring about the expulsion or whatever. And as Izuku would watch this, he would realize that he might have just made the mistake. So, as time would pass, All Might would eventually walk into the room, with him going on to explain, "I am here," before showing the classroom to their hero sets, and then begins explaining what they're going to do today, which essentially consists of the 2v2 battles. So as everybody would begin to draw lots, Bakugo would go over there hoping that he can draw Izuku. However, when the name doesn't pop up, he would get royally pissed, knowing that the group section that he had chosen was somebody else, a team of weaklings in his eyes, staring daggers at Momo and Mineta, with Mineta literally getting behind Momo and saying that he's scary to protect him. This would probably lead to Mineta grabbing her in some places that won't be mentioned, with Momo getting very annoyed at the pervert, and Izuku simply just watching on at the hilarious situation that was going down. So with that being said, Izuku would finally go up and get his teammate, which would be Uraraka, and he would find himself facing off against the other half and half quirk user, Todoroki and Mina. So with Izuku finally getting these results, he would think to himself that this is actually going to be a bit fun. He gets to fight against the other kid with the half and half quirk on his first day of class. Izuku would be psyched at this, looking to Todoroki, who would not even pay Izuku any mind, having an expression that says, "I don't even want to be here." As Izuku sees him walk inside, Izuku would think to himself that he better show that guy a lesson, because if he's going to take him lightly, well, he's just gonna have to show him to never do that again. So as Izuku and Uraraka would walk into the building, this is when All Might would start everything, with the building completely freezing. Izuku, not having expected that, would be shocked, with himself and Uraraka beginning to shiver from the cold, but this is when Izuku would smile, saying that Todoroki is a pretty helpful lad, going on to convert the molecules in the ice back to water, with Izuku saying that though it is a little strenuous, they just need a little bit of a boost, and then Izuku can use them to his own benefit. So with that being said, Izuku and Uraraka would continue making their way, looking to different rooms until eventually they would enter one where Todoroki would be inside. Izuku, seeing this, would look towards Uraraka, telling her that she should probably get out of here, that this is not a place for a lady to be. And her hearing this would say that she needs help, but Izuku would give her a look of, "I got this, go find the bomb and I promise we'll win." And Uraraka, hearing this, putting her faith in her teammate, would proceed to do exactly that, with Izuku now facing Todoroki, who would quickly attempt to freeze him solid, saying that he didn't expect him to be able to get out of his last attack. However, the moment that the ice would begin getting closer to Izuku, suddenly a lightning dragon would be sent towards the direction of the boy, who would shatter the ice, all the while simultaneously sending Todoroki flying, causing the boy's hair to start spiking up like crazy. The dude looks like the doctor that created Frankenstein. So with Izuku now staring off at Todoroki, he would go on to tell him to go ahead and use his other half of his quirk, signaling to his hair and saying that he wants to see him at his full power. Todoroki would grit his teeth before saying that he doesn't need that half, shooting more ice at Deku, which Deku would simply just destroy, telling him that he's not going to get very far in this battle if he simply relies on ice. So after destroying icicle after icicle after icicle, and Izuku would get impatient, Izuku would finally let out a disgruntled sigh, looking towards Todoroki and telling him, you don't have to act so high and mighty. Just because you think your opponent is weaker than you doesn't mean that's the truth. Before then going to tell him that he's not the only one with a half and half quirk. Todoroki, hearing this, would be stunned, to which Izuku would tell him that if he doesn't want to use his quirk, that's fine. He'll just end the battle right now, since he's done wasting his time. And as Todoroki would stare to the direction of Izuku, shocked, then staring at his two-toned hair, he would think that there is a chance that Izuku would be telling the truth. However, still unwilling to use his fire side, Todoroki would once again shoot an ice attack to the direction of Izuku, which Izuku, now finally tired of, would shoot one of his most potent lightning attacks. This would thunder in the building as you would hear the sound of crackling and thunder, as Mina and Uraraka would both jump in unison, being completely thrown off guard, all the while Todoroki would be completely fried by the effects of his quirk. After this would be done, Izuku would make his way towards the direction of where Uraraka would be at after she would call him via the comms, and arriving there and seeing that the bomb was now in reach, Izuku would tell Uraraka to walk behind him, that they're about to do something a little cool. So, walking inside, Izuku would proceed to walk with a strange dark cloud behind him and a little bit of lightning crackling off. He then, staring at Mina, would go on to tell her to be a doll and get out of the way, since he doesn't exactly enjoy hitting pretty girls. Mina, hearing that and seeing the quirk usage of Izuku, the precision, the cloud, the lightning, and then remembering that thunder crack noise, would proceed to just walk out of Izuku's way with a slight blush, and Uraraka, hearing that and seeing the display of power, would think that Izuku's kind of... But Scratching that thought from her head, saying that no, she's here to be a hero, Izuku would go grab the bomb as everybody in the watch party room would start to give their thoughts on the battle, with Momo saying that Izuku Midoriya is the clear MVP. His quirk usage is that on the level of a pro hero, maybe even above that. He uses his quirk as though he's been training with it his entire life. All Might would note that his quirk usage is genuinely incredible, and he would think of maybe passing his quirk on to Izuku. He would become a genuine monster if he had one for all. The speed to go along with that lightning attack, it would be deadly. All Might would shudder at the thought, but before he could complete this thought, this is when suddenly Mineta would say, "Whoa, he's incredible," as Kaminari's match would have already happened before this, and he would say, "Wait, he's just a better version of him, isn't he?" Signaling to Kaminari, who now would feel terrible at this, having been compared to somebody like Izuku, since it doesn't exactly feel too good when you're compared to somebody that is way better than you at a specific skill. So Kaminari, now feeling horrible about this, would think that maybe it wouldn't cause them too much harm if he was to ask Izuku to maybe help him out with his quirk. So with that being said, and the day would be over, Kaminari walking over towards Izuku would ask him if he has any tips on him to use his quirk. Izuku turning to Kaminari would say, "Oh right, you also have like an electricity quirk, don't you? What's it called again?" Kaminari would look at him, telling him it's called Thunderbolt or something like that. I forgot what the real name was, but let's just go with Thunderbolt. As Izuku would say, "That's a pretty cool quirk name. Well, if you want some tips on how to use your quirk, I could be happy to help you out. Just meet me at Dagoma Beach in about 3 hours. Give me some time to shower, eat, and maybe watch a couple anime episodes." And Kaminari, hearing this, would say, "Sweet, I'll see you there." So by the time that the sun would be setting, the two would arrive there with Izuku wearing a tank top and these cool little baggy cargo pants. This is when, walking over towards Kaminari, Izuku would ask how much control he has on his quirk. Kaminari would use it as it would sporadically go everywhere, and Izuku, controlling Kaminari's lightning as though it was his own that he had conjured, would proceed to stop it in his tracks, telling Kaminari that he sees the problem. The problem isn't necessarily the voltage of the lightning, but instead the control. He would go on to ask Kaminari how much training he's had with this quirk, and Kaminari would say that he's actually trained a lot. He's upped the voltage over the last couple of years. Izuku would nod, saying that he figured that was the case. He would tell Kaminari that over the next couple of weeks, he's not going to focus at all on the power. In fact, he's going to use the lowest voltage and focus on controlling the quirk. He would then go on to explain to Kaminari how it was that he found so much control over his quirk by telling him that he simply kept it active all day, every day for 10 years. And with Kaminari hearing that, he would think that he'll never catch up. But Izuku would say that while he might not be able to get to his level exactly in a couple of months, he would be able to surpass his own level. And that's all that Kaminari needs to be worried about. He doesn't exactly have to compare himself to him. Not everyone's the same. Kaminari hearing this would say thanks, as Izuku would then go on to explain to him to charge up his lightning just in his finger. Kaminari would now spend the next 15 minutes trying to do that, and once that would be done, Izuku would tell him, "Alright, good, now channel it through your middle finger." Then his second to last pinky finger, and thumb. After Kaminari would be doing that, he would be exhausted, and would go on to ask Izuku if they're done, with his shirt being completely drenched in sweat. Izuku would say that they're almost done, that about 1 more hour would be left, but he needs to go get some rest. Kaminari can do that and then go to school the next day. And so Kaminari would do just that, arriving at school completely drained of energy, with him saying that Izuku's a monster for training that way. Izuku would go on to tell him that due to the way that his quirk limits him, he has to train 10 times harder in order to control, since he had completely focused on the wrong thing over the last couple of years. Kaminari, feeling sorry for himself, would say that he will do that, and so every other day Izuku would go to monitor Kaminari's training, with him slowly getting better at it day by day, eventually starting to sort of get the hang of controlling his quirk and not being too dangerous of a liability to the heroes. So with that said, Izuku and Kaminari would actually end up developing a little bit of a friendship, with the USJ event finally coming around, the students exiting the bus, and all of them then turning towards the hero 13, who would give her a little lame speech. As this would be happening, Kurogiri's portal mist would begin to open, and with that would come a horde of villains, Shigaraki, the Nomu, and all the villains that would be in the disaster zones. Izuku, seeing this, not wasting a single second, would leap into action direction, creating a massive storm in the air as his eyes would start glowing with lightning sparkles going through them, and Izuku powering this thunderstorm. This would cover the entirety of the USJ's ceiling, as Izuku would turn towards the villain and tell him that unless he wants every single villain here in the hospital for the foreseeable future, they better leave. Kurogiri would tell him that he's bluffing, that there's no way a student could manage that, and even if he could, he wouldn't be able to do that without damaging his teammates. However, Izuku, without wasting a second, would simply say, "You wanna bet?" as the sound of thunder crackling would be heard throughout the entire area and a massive boom would go through the stadium. This would shock the villain, who's seeing everybody, including his master Shigaraki, out like a light. This would lead the villain to quickly acting and teleporting out of there alongside the boss Shigaraki and the Nomu, leaving everything as though it was normal. And with Izuku now having taken care of the villains fully, he would go on to turn towards the class, asking Aizawa if they can now hold their training exercise. Aizawa would be stunned, never imagining that a student would react even better than a hero, thinking that he sure is glad that Izuku's on the hero side. And to that, he would then go on to answer Izuku that that's not happening. Not only do they have to clean up the villains that have all been knocked out by his quirk, but they also need to get the details and statements from everybody. And now the police arrive. So after brief statements would be had, and the students would return to school the next day, seeing as the situation had 0 casualties, 0 damage, and 0 trauma to the students, they all would return, going back to normal classes, where they would be informed a lot earlier of the fact that the UA Sports Festival was gonna go down soon. So with that said, Kaminari would go over towards Izuku, asking him to prepare for that, saying that while he doesn't exactly plan to get stronger than him over this time, he does want to impress his family, he wants to impress the heroes scouting him, and he wants to at least light a candle to Izuku. So he would ask him if for the next week they can actually train together. So Kaminari, getting a glimpse of what Izuku's training regimen looks like, would proceed to do that with Kaminari for a week. Until eventually the time for the UA Sports Festival would come and go, and Izuku would find himself at the podium giving a little bit of a speech. And once the speech would be finished, Midnight would go on to announce what the first event would be, starting us off with an obstacle course. And the moment that this would begin, Todoroki would start by shooting ice everywhere, leaving many of the contestants stuck in place. And Izuku, noticing this, would proceed to concentrate as Izuku would take the molecules within the ice and shift them, turning them all back to water, as everybody would now be free, and Izuku would make his way in front of the pack, running as fast as he possibly could, only then to see an explosion of 0-point robots falling down, with Izuku thinking to himself that Todoroki is definitely a pain in his side right now. Immediately, Deku would lift his hand into the air with a little bit of a storm cloud forming, and Izuku then aiming it towards the direction of the robots. A gigantic blast of golden lightning would envelop, and an explosion would absolutely consume all of the robots left there as an obstacle. This would free everybody to continue making their way towards the direction of the rest of the course, and as soon as this would happen, Izuku would find himself at a strange area where he has to cross the zip line or make massive jumps in order to get to the other side. But due to the fact that Izuku doesn't have any way of particularly using his quirk to help him out in this situation, since he doesn't exactly have mobility, Izuku just kind of watches as Mei Hatsume eventually runs behind him, shooting her gadgets, and then we have Tenya Ida using his Recipro Burst little quirk, as well as Uraraka using her anti-gravity on herself, causing herself to float all the way across and then fall to the ground and hold her tummy, since she definitely wouldn't feel fine after that. But I say all that pretty much just to say that this would kind of be a little bit of a wake-up call to Izuku, where he realizes that yeah, he needs to add some sort of mobility factor to his quirk, or add some sort of support item that can help him move faster, because if he's limited by that, the amount of good stuff that he's going to be able to do as a hero is going to be very much so limited. And so, with that being the case, Izuku would simply crawl, much like Izuku would have in the original, with him eventually making his way towards where the bombs are at, and him noticing that a lot of people are actually apprehensive to make their way through that. So, Izuku slamming both hands to the ground would shoot a charge of electricity that would disable all the mines, as Izuku would run by, making it seem as though he was being careful not to set them off, but eventually some people would catch on to the fact that Deku had done that just to trick them into not passing by him. So after Izuku would have ended up locking in 6th place, everybody else would follow suit, and the event would finally be over. Once that would be said, Izuku would would stare towards the direction of Todoroki and Bakugo, realizing that even though in a one-on-one battle he is technically at their level, he's still lacking some sort of creativity when it comes to his quirk. Bakugo uses his explosions to move around, propelling himself, and Todoroki uses his ice to slide around and make travel easy. Izuku would now start thinking about any possible ways that he could use his quirk to maybe fly or something. But the more that he would brainstorm on this, the less ideas would eventually come to him, with him putting this at the back of his mind until eventually the next event would be announced to everybody, which would consist of the Calvary battle, which Izuku in this timeline would then go on to choose his teammates in Uraraka, Kaminari, and Jiro, just because, Kaminari had asked for that. So once this team would be assembled, Uraraka would proceed to use her ability to make them weightless to lead Izuku as the head of the pack, and with him being on top, Izuku would quickly go on to form a storm around them that would shoot off charges of lightning, which if anybody was to dare to get close to them, would proceed to shock them and most likely knock the rider off, so nobody would dare get close. That includes Todoroki and Bakugo, meaning that until the last possible moment, his team would practically be doing nothing, with Izuku barely managing to waste any stamina until the clock would mark 6 seconds. This would be Izuku's cue to stop the attack in its entirety and run right past Todoroki, who, being distracted by Katsuki Bakugo's explosions and constant ambushes trying to get his headband, would not see Jiro's headphone thing coming in and snatching the million-point headband. And with this taking place, this means that Izuku's team would end up being the one to come out on top, with Izuku turning to Todoroki and signaling to him that he's sorry, but he wanted to make sure that his victory was absolute. And now, comfortably staring at Bakugo, Bakugo would snarl at that remark before walking off and telling him that he hopes that he has a good plan when they actually face off against each other. Izuku would smile, thinking to himself that that's not going to be much of a big deal for him. And so, the 1v1 battles would begin, with the bracket starting as follows: Izuku versus Jiro. And I'm not going to lie to y'all, the first match would be a little bit boring just because of the fact that without Jiro having her support items, she wasn't really going to be able to do much against Izuku offensively. So by the time that the event would begin, Jiro would raise her hand immediately, saying that she gives up, with Izuku smiling and telling her that she made the right choice, that sometimes you gotta know when you're beat. And he would shake her hand, with Jiro saying that yeah, she definitely was beat. So the next match would then begin, and as Izuku would find himself in the ring, he would see that the girl in front of him would be one with green hair that looks like vines. Izuku stares at it, wondering if that would mean that this would pose some trouble for his quirk, seeing as her vines might make his electricity not as conductive. So, as the match would begin, Izuku would test this hypothesis by shooting a lightning attack towards her, which her vines would quickly go on to wrap around herself, blocking out the attack. This would lead Izuku to have a bit of a smile on his face, as he would think to himself that this girl is going to be a bit of a tough opponent. Suddenly, however, Izuku would have a smile crack, as the moisture within her hair would start to literally disappear, because of the fact that Izuku has a water quirk and he was able to manipulate the water that's actually within her hair. He caused it to dry up, and now instead of it having that luscious shine that allowed her to control her hair, it had dried up to the point where she was unable to block the attack. So the next time that Izuku had shot a lightning bolt towards her, she was completely taken off guard by this and would be sent flying out of the arena. This is when Izuku, after having won, would walk over towards her, asking her if she's okay, with her saying that his quirk is impressive, that she never would have expected him to have used a move like that to drain the moisture out of her hair. She would ask how it was that he was able to pull that off, and Izuku would simply tell her that a magician never reveals his secrets. She would tell him that it was a good match, and Izuku would agree, as the both would go on their own ways, and we would eventually make our way towards the third match, which would consist of Izuku versus Kaminari, who this time around, thanks to not having had to go up against the Vine Girl, who was literally the perfect counter to his quirk, he was able to make a way this far, also thanks to the fact that Izuku had trained him, so Kaminari was very much so a lot more powerful. So by the time that the two warriors would stand in the ring, Kaminari would shoot a lightning bolt of electricity towards Izuku, which Izuku would block by using an orb made of water. Kaminari would be stunned, as President Mike would go on to say that that's insane. insane. Izuku Midoriya has just used water to block this attack. With him going on to ask Aizawa if this student also happens to have a half and half quirk like Todoroki. Aizawa would go on to explain that Izuku's quirk actually does function like that, and if anything, the quirk registry that he has is a little bit inaccurate. His quirk, by proxy, should really be named half water, half lightning, and as Izuku would hear that on the intercoms, and Kaminari would hear that as well, Kaminari would then ask Izuku why don't they give the people what they came to see. So, charging up his most potent attack, he would send it flying towards Izuku, to which Izuku would do the same thing, cancelling out Kaminari's attack before then shooting a water bullet towards Kaminari that he was completely unable to block due to the speed and precision. And so, as Kaminari would be sent flying off the ring, Izuku would hold a hand out telling him that was a good match and that he's impressed, as we would now get on to the final matchup, which would be Izuku versus Katsuki Bakugo. Once the two contestants would make their way into the ring, Izuku, staring towards Bakugo, would ask him if he's ready to finally have their little one-on-one. Bakugo would turn towards Izuku, telling him that he is, and that after today's match, he's gonna make sure Izuku regrets ever having been born. This is when the match would commence, and Bakugo would lunge towards the direction of Deku, making it seem as though he was going for a frontal assault before shooting a smoke bomb and flying up into the air. He would immediately follow this by AP shots, 18 of them to be exact, with Izuku blocking these attacks with a water barrier that Izuku would use to soften the blows. This would be very useful for blocking Bakugo's long-range attacks, and with Bakugo seeing Deku's defense, he would yell out, "Damn Deku, what, you're just gonna rely on defense this whole match? Go on the offensive already!" So Izuku, hearing that, would tell Bakugo to make his way to the ground so that he can do that, with Bakugo looking towards Izuku and smiling, telling him that he's not an idiot, that the moment that he touches the ground, Izuku will hit him with so many volts that it'll have his head spinning. But he's not going to give him the chance to do that, since after all, the entirety of the arena is full of water, and that's going to make his attacks even more conductive. Izuku, realizing that Bakugo had taken note of that, something that nobody else would have, unless it was maybe Kaminari, Izuku would give Bakugo his props, telling him that he can't win by simply staying up there, as Izuku would then go on to aim his hand up at the sky, and with two fingers he would shoot up a massive charge of lightning. The clouds would then turn into this black color, and as Izuku would start manipulating the storm in the air, Izuku would suddenly have a gigantic dragon coming down from the sky in the shape of lightning, just destroying Bakugo. Bakugo, now falling onto the ground, would feel completely burned, like the man was just destroyed in his entirety. And as Izuku would get closer and closer to Bakugo, he would go on to pick Bakugo by the hair, before then asking him how exactly it feels to have someone so much stronger than you belittle you. He would stare right into Bakugo's eyes, asking him to do something, to use his quirk, that maybe it'll work this time. So as Bakugo would be unable to give up and his pride would not allow him, he would then swing his hand towards Deku, shooting another explosion, which would quickly be blocked by a small little bit of water, which would take most of the blow. Izuku in this moment would then proceed to slowly drag Bakugo out of the arena, with President Mike saying, "Whoa, it appears Bakugo has refused to give up and is forcing Izuku Midoriya to drag him out of the arena. That's willpower if I've ever seen it." And right as Izuku would be about to throw Bakugo out, he would look towards him, telling him to enjoy second place, as he would toss the barely conscious Bakugo out of the arena, leading a bunch of cheers to then echo out through the stadium, with people cheering the name Izuku. And as Bakugo would wake up in the infirmary hours later, after the whole ceremony session had passed, and Bakugo was, told that he was going to be in the hospital recovering after his match with Izuku, he would hear about how Izuku was given the first place medal, and how he gave a little speech inspiring everybody. But more than everything, Bakugo would watch videos and clips going viral of himself literally getting treated like nothing by Izuku. And as Bakugo would watch these over and over, rage would begin boiling over the boy. He would blow up his phone that he was holding in his hands as he would lay back down contemplating how in the world someone like Izuku managed to get that much stronger than him. Rage, hatred, and a bitter desire for revenge would consume the boy, with Bakugo completely changing after the fact, him going dead silent and simply training in order to best Izuku in combat to make sure that something like that would never happen again. Although while that would be taking place, however, the students would return back to UA where they would be informed of not only the internships, but the fact that they need to start thinking about their hero names, and we would get that whole montage of everybody choosing them, with Izuku choosing the name Thunderstorm, since I can't see anything else fitting Izuku more than that. So, with that being said, Izuku would now only be left with one choice, who he was going to internship with. And seeing as Izuku had actually gotten first place this time around, I don't see it too crazy to assume that some other heroes might reach out to him, with one of them being the pro hero Ryuku, the dragon hero, someone who doesn't usually send intern invites to people, but she was very impressed by Izuku. So with Izuku noting that a big time hero like her sent him an internship request, Izuku immediately accepts and goes on to learn a couple of things from Ryuku, but the main thing that Izuku would learn would be the basic principles to apply flight to his half and half quirk. Izuku would have been watching anime one of these days and would have eventually seen a clip of Goku using the flying Nimbus, and with Izuku thinking that that's not exactly how clouds work, but maybe it could be, Izuku would begin on working on manipulating his cloud to allow him to fly, with the early stages of that causing Izuku to fall over and over and over. But thanks to the fact that he had the guidance of the pro hero Ryuku and even help from Nejire, who he went on to meet during this time, Izuku eventually starts getting the hang of it, now starting to learn how to apply speed to it and how to make it actually move. Since after all, the cloud didn't have a will of his own, so Izuku had to be the one completely in charge of all that. And by the time that this would be taking place, Ida would probably have found himself in the unfortunate circumstances of facing Stain, leading to the death of Ida this time around, meaning that by the time that the students would all be done with their pro hero internships, everybody would catch wind of the fact that their beloved Clash rep Ida was now dead. And with that spreading to the news this time around, I can see that causing a huge scandal for UA. This would most likely result in UA to be shut down for at bare minimum weeks, if not a month, which is what we're going to be going with. So with this time period that Izuku has of school getting in indefinite suspension for the time being, Izuku would spend his time training as much as he possibly could, eventually beginning to get the hang and even master his cloud quirk potential, giving Izuku now the ability to fly on a literal cloud that can not only fly but shoot lightning sparks wherever the heck it goes and even rain down hail on people, which in case you guys are not aware of how potent hail can really be, if you guys have ever stood around and it started hailing and those little freaking rock pebbles started hitting you, oh man, they hurt. Now just imagine those things being massive and falling on people's heads, bro. That sounds devastating. Low-key hit me with a lightning bolt instead, because that sounds horrid. But anyways, Izuku's time would not only be spent doing that, since obviously his good pal Kaminari would definitely come by for some training every now and then. And by the time that UA would finally get over this scandal, thanks to the Ida family actually making a statement on part of UA and saying that it was not UA's fault, the school would be once again allowed to reopen, now with the dormitory system being active. And with that being the case, the students would all be questioned on whether they would return, or technically the parents would. And everybody would say yes, with the exception of Katsuki Bakugo, who himself would be the one to deny returning back to UA. And since Katsuki was completely unwilling to go, even if they were to have signed him back up into the UA program, it would have been for nothing, because the boy at the current moment was just disappearing and returning home whenever he had pleased, oftentimes coming back with scars all over his body and bruises to boat with that. So Katsuki's mother was completely confused as to what was going on with their son. So Izuku, catching wind of the fact that Bakugo was the only student not to return, would think that his defeat at his hands about a month ago might have actually had something to do with that. So Izuku, being the person that he is and not wanting to do this, but thinking that maybe an apology would be in order, he would make his way towards the Katsuki residence, where upon arriving and asking his mother on where Bakugo is, she would say that she has no clue, that the damn bastard just disappears and comes back whenever he pleases. Izuku would apologize to her, saying that he thinks it's his fault, and she would say that it's nobody's fault, that it's that damn Katsuki's fault for being so weak that he was able to get brutalized the way that he was. He'd be shocked that that was her reaction, but Izuku would then walk off. And this is when suddenly Bakugo, hands in his pocket, black tank top and scars and bruises on him once again, would stare at Izuku straight in the eye, not saying anything but simply giving Izuku a creepy smile, kinda similar to the one that Toga would give Izuku, with Bakugo simply uttering right after he had passed him that soon he'll be the one coughing out blood on the ground. And as Izuku would hear that from Bakugo, he would think that that is not a good sign, as he would then turn towards him and tell Bakugo that he was sorry. Bakugo would stop, then turn towards Izuku and give him a look of rage, telling him that sorry wasn't gonna cut it. And as he would walk off, Izuku would stare at the back of Bakugo, thinking that that was all his fault. However, he does think that Bakugo might be able to work through it. Maybe the guy's just overreacting. So walking off and thinking that things will just resolve themselves, he would return to UA attending normal school systems when eventually the news would come that a family nearby was murdered in a homicide accident. It appears that an explosion went on in their house and 2 people died, the parents of Katsuki Bakugo. And since there was no remains found of the young boy, there's suspicions that due to the fact that how his quirk works, he may have actually been the cause. And interestingly enough, that was the case, because the worst case scenario ended up happening. After Izuku had disappeared, tensions began to rise between Katsuki's mom and himself, where she would tell him to stop disappearing and that he's not allowed to just do whatever he sees fit. The screaming in his face would continue until eventually Bakugo, getting tired of his mother, would simply blow the entirety of the house to Kingdom Come. This would lead to the death of both his parents and Bakugo to eventually leave the home in its entirety, joining his new family in the League of Villains. That said, as Izuku would catch wind of this, he would immediately rush to the principal's office, telling him that he had no clue that that's what he had caused. He would tell Nezu that he feels responsible for their deaths, that had he not humiliated Bakugo, had he not pushed things so far, he would still be at UA and things would be progressing as normal. But Nezu would tell him not to worry and that this was an inevitability, that Izuku has nothing to do with the actions that Bakugo chose, that while maybe he might have aided to Bakugo's rage, he's the one who ultimately decided to use his quirk for villainy. So with Izuku having some of his worries quelled, Nezu would go on to tell him that he's doing everything he can to make sure that Bakugo is returned safe and sound home, and they can find out the true story of what really happened that night. So as Izuku would hear those words from Nezu, he would nod, exiting the room and hoping for the best. After this would take place, UA would decide that the best course of action would probably be to train their students as best as they can. Seeing as the future with the Katsuki situation and that getting out to the public, with people discovering that all evidence is most likely shooting towards that Bakugo was the one responsible, UA needs to bide their options and teach the students as much as they possibly can. And so instead of opting to do the final exams, which would normally take place, I think that it would probably be in their best interest to actually move forward with the forced training camp. So that's exactly what happens. UA would do it just like they would have in the original, with the assistance of the Wild Wild Pussycats. So as the bus would arrive on top of a weird looking cliff and all of the students would get off to see that the ground was nearby, they would all ask what they're doing here, with Aizawa looking at them with a bit of a devilish grin. After this, Mandalay, using her quirk, would proceed to have the mud on the ground shoot them off, as they would all land on the ground with a thump, to which they would all see these gigantic mud monsters. Izuku, seeing this, would think that it's a perfect opportunity for him to work on his water quirk, seeing as Izuku can admit that he has a bit of a tendency to undermine that side of it. So, completely letting go of his lightning side, Izuku would primarily focus on water attacks, water vortexes, water dragons, water bullets, and water defenses. And this training would prove very beneficial for Izuku, because he was giving targets that were not only attacking him, but were actually reacting to the attacks Izuku was throwing. And seeing as the robots themselves had pretty decent durability, this would actually help Izuku out a lot, because it would help Izuku make small incremental changes to his quirk, which would help him out in the long run. That said, UA would eventually take this time to start teaching their students all they can and address the situation of the school, finding themselves in a very particular situation. So all the students would give it their all, thinking that this genuinely could be one of the last times that they're here with these mentors, people like Aizawa, the Wild Blood Pussycats, and even Principal Nezu there to overlook everything. The students would question why it is that All Might wasn't here, and unfortunately for them, because they weren't able to know the real reason as to why that was the case, they would give them some half-hearted lie, saying that they can't exactly take the symbol of peace out of Japan, because if that was the case, then who's going to be stopping all those crazy bad guys? So the students, after hearing this, half-true, reason as to why All Might wouldn't be there, would all decide to accept this. And so, as 2 weeks would finally come and go, and the students would have taken a lot of advantages during this time, eventually, on one of the students' final nights, as they would all be packing things up ready for bed, suddenly the sounds of flames would be heard in the distance, accompanied by strangely very loud explosions. Izuku, upon hearing this, would wake up out of his bed thinking that he must have been dreaming. He was just reminiscing the battle that he had with Bakugo, but no. As soon as Aizawa would stare out the window and see a fire outside ablazing the forest, he would immediately order the students to stay inside and to protect each other. Worst comes to worst, they're allowed to use their quirks, but for now, they all stay here. Izuku in this moment would try to protest to that, saying that he can help them. He knows he can. But as Aizawa would stare at Izuku using his quirk erasure ability on him, telling him that he will not go outside, Izuku would sit back down, understanding that his teacher is dead serious, and that something genuinely must be wrong for his teacher to be acting in such a fashion. So, simply watching from the window, Izuku would watch on as the Wild Pussycats, Principal Nezu, and Aizawa would all make an attempt at defeating these villains. However, these villains would prove far too much for them, with a cloaked figure in the back still yet to make a move. The Wild Pussycats would have at first pushed them backwards with the help of Aizawa's quirk erasure, but after Aizawa had a blink, Muscular quickly got the upper hand on them, and with Dabi's help, he was able to blind Aizawa's side of vision by creating such a large fire that Aizawa was separated from the group. This in turn allowed the Wildcats to be defeated, and once that took place, Aizawa and Nezu were now the ones cornered, with Nezu using robots that he would have brought, trying to use them to stall, which would in turn work just long enough for Izuku, knowing that he wasn't going to be able to live with himself if he sat idly by all the while the teachers, risking their lives to defend him, went out there and died. So, with a thundercloud, Izuku would proceed to arrive onto the scene, shattering through the window and telling them that he's going to help, whether Aizawa wants him to or not. So as a lightning bolt would strike down on one of the villains, Mr. Compressed to be exact, Izuku would then stare towards the direction of the rest of them, asking them if they're ready for what's coming. This would leave the battle-crazed monster Muscular to rush towards Deku, telling him that he can't wait to rumble. But the second that this would happen, the man's head would explode in an instant, with the cloaked figure behind him finally acting, having moved so incredibly fast that Izuku was shell-shocked at the speed. Muscular's head must have exploded in less than half a second, and it almost appeared as though the one in front of him had barely moved. All too suddenly, that cloak would uncover his face, and Izuku's worst fear would be revealed. None other than Bakugo would be there, with red glowing skin thanks to the quirk amplification that it was given to him, courtesy of All for One. This quirk that essentially allowed Bakugo gave him the ability to use the quirk power that he would have awakened in the manga, known as Cluster, and using that he was moving at tremendous speeds that were even capable of catching somebody like Shigaraki off guard. So with Bakugo's next attack, he would blast an explosion in the face of Deku, which would send this man crashing into the building, with him being stunned at the power and explosive impact that that blast would have packed. Izuku would stare back up at Bakugo, who would walk over towards Izuku, telling him that a promise is a promise, remember? This time, he was gonna be the one eating dirt. And who knows, maybe if he begs hard enough, he might just spare him his life. So as Izuku would slowly get back up, Bakugo would speed blitz Izuku, smashing an explosion square at the shoulder of Deku, much like he would have done in the first episode of the anime, sitting the boy back down, who now looking up and feeling the difference between Bakugo's power at the sports festival to now, would simply look up at Bakugo in horror, wondering how in the world he had gotten so powerful. So with Izuku not knowing what else to do but ask, he would do just that, and Bakugo would smile, telling him that he had a little bit of help from a friend. Since after all, it was like Izuku said, they're on different levels now. So throwing Izuku into the air with an explosion propelling him, Izuku suddenly would create a cloud. Mounting it, Izuku would stare downwards, with Bakugo having moved so fast he hadn't even tracked him. And by the time the sound of the explosion would ring in Deku's ears, he would look up to see Bakugo shooting an explosion at him, which Deku would narrowly manage to tank most of the blow thanks to using his water quirk. This would shock Bakugo, who hadn't expected Izuku to have improved that much, telling him that he can see that he did a little bit of improving on his own, asking him just how far he thinks he'll be able to go against this newfound empowered version of himself. And as Izuku would stare at his former friend, he would tell him that he's sorry. But Bakugo, not listening to anything, would tell him that he's not here for that, blasting an explosion towards the direction of Izuku as the two-toned hair boy would be hit to the ground, all the while simultaneously having aimed a powerful lightning bolt toward the sky. This would in turn proceed to turn the climate to his advantage. So in this moment, as Izuku would crash down onto the ground, holding his hands out to manipulate the weather around him, Izuku would start channeling these massive lightning particles, which would start to actually rain down on Bakugo, who was walking closer and closer towards Izuku. But this is when all too suddenly it would be revealed that Izuku's trump card was seemingly being nullified, since Bakugo was also given a quirk called Lightning Rod, which essentially allowed him to absorb the kinetic energy from that and transfer to his quirk. And since Bakugo now had this at his disposal, he would proceed to smile, telling Izuku thanks for the power-up, before raising his left hand and whooshing it at the air. This would release an explosion that would wipe out 30% of the forest, with Izuku having barely managed to tank most of the explosion thanks to a water barrier that he would have created and water armor that he would have placed around himself. As Izuku would look around feeling hopeless at the situation, he would then watch on as Kaminari, rushing out of the building to shoot his most potent blast of lightning at the sky, would look towards Izuku with the thumbs up. This is when the boy would immediately turn to an idiot, falling to the ground and pretty much being completely defenseless. The villain Magnus, seeing this, would go to attack the boy. However, before he could land a proficient blow, Kirishima, tanking the attack for him, would be sent flying, as Kaminari, now standing there looking like an idiot, would suddenly be saved by Aizawa, who would proceed to stare at the direction of Bakugo, giving Izuku just enough time to blast him with a powerful mouth beam explosion, combining water and electricity to form a thunderstorm-like blast that would consume Katsuki, dealing massive amounts of damage to him, burning and charring the boy. But his resolve would be far too strong, and much like how Dabi would have refused to give up in the final war arc, Bakugo would do the same. Izuku, in this moment gaining some distance and mounting his cloud, would proceed to fly up into the air, signaling to Bakugo to follow along if he can. And as Izuku would fly higher and higher and higher, Bakugo would suddenly have his quirk return to him the moment that other villains would attack Aizawa, and he would be forced to blink. So in one swift movement, an explosion would crackle, with Bakugo being side by side Izuku, and Izuku smirking, Bakugo telling him that that weak little attack won't work, charging up the most powerful explosion that he could muster without the aid of Izuku's power-up. So, as he would throw this potent explosion towards the direction of Izuku, Izuku, absorbing the kinetic energy from Kaminari's lightning blast that he would have shot up with the clouds mixing, would then proceed to create his most powerful attack, a Buddha/Zeus-like creature, which would throw a massive lightning bolt towards the direction of Katsuki, which would completely completely overload the quirk that Bakugo was given, because much like the Nomu's regeneration, which essentially just needed more powerful blows than it could, regenerate from, that's essentially the same principle being used here. So with Bakugo being completely enveloped by this blast, his body, finally unable to react to this, would proceed to be overwhelmed, the quirks just completely malfunctioning as he would crash down onto the ground with a loud thump. Him now only having seconds left to live, his body giving out on him, Izuku would fly down towards the direction of Bakugo, simply telling him how sorry he was. Tears spewing out of his face, he would tell Bakugo that he was sorry for what he had done to him, that he was sorry for leading Bakugo to becoming a villain, and that he was sorry for making a fool of him out of the entrance exam. But Bakugo wouldn't reply with "it's okay" or "damn you." He would just say, "Shut up, damn nerd," as he would die. The weight of everything he had done up to that moment finally hitting him, as tears would begin flowing out of the young man's eyes before everything would just go dark. This is when Izuku, holding the lifeless body of Bakugo on the ground, would just have something break inside of him. He would realize that he was an idiot. He had left his overconfidence and his desire to get even with Bakugo to get the better of him. It was his fault that Bakugo was here. Yeah, Bakugo was a bully and a jerk, but he had never caused something like this. He had killed him. He killed him, he would think, with those words reverberating through Izuku's mind as he would hold the boy's body. This is when suddenly, after the rest of the villains would have been defeated thanks to the aid of the classmates of Izuku, Aizawa would walk over towards him, putting a hand on his shoulder, telling him that that was not his fault, that everybody makes their own decisions, and they're liable for their own consequences. So with that being said, Izuku would eventually pick himself off the ground, still trying to process the events that had just taken place, as the police would arrive. And with that being said, the news about Bakugo being the one who had truly killed his parents, having become a villain, and not only become a villain, but joined the League of Villains and participated in an attack on UA, that would pretty much be the last straw for the school. The prodigious school would be forced to shut down via the media, having deemed that school completely unstable, having one student die to revenge and another one becoming a villain for unknown reasons. They would say that UA is no longer the school that had raised multiple heroes, and that the students there would be better off leading a different life in a different academia. So, as the school would be shut down, multiple of the students there would either be forced to give up their hero career, having had scholarships for UA, and others would decide that it's probably in their best interest to go to different hero schools. Izuku would actually fall into that second category. So, with him making his way to the next best thing, Izuku would wind up at Shiketsu High, where Izuku would have completely, after time passed, have lost that edginess and would have developed a more humble attitude with a much more self-sacrificial personality being added, seeing as Izuku felt a weight on him to make up for the loss of the hero that Bakugo would have been. That said, after everything would finally calm down and the people would have mostly forgotten the UA scandal, eventually something new would break out, that Tartarus had been broken into, courtesy of All For One, Shigaraki, and Kurogiri, who had been working to recapture the villains that had previously been taken during the forest incident that had just taken place. And with that being the case, All For One would enlist more people to work under Shigaraki, which he would then go on to leave Shigaraki into improving as a leader, having him go through that same training arc that we would see him go through in the My Villain Academia, with All For One's guidance this time around. That said, this news reaching the people would lead Izuku to swearing that he was going to do everything in his power to make sure he could capture these villains when they make their move. And so, as more time would pass, eventually the villains would strike once again, with an incident so massive in scale that it actually ended up destroying a literal city, and the villains known for this would have been the ones that normally would have been responsible for taking down the Liberation Army, much like in canon. So with that being said, Izuku, now discovering that the League of Villains has now become that potent, would realize that this is no longer an organization to be taken lightly, but something that could genuinely shift the balance in Japan forever. So with Izuku thinking about this and wondering how he can possibly prepare himself for this, apocalyptic like event, Izuku would suddenly remember something All Might had told him during the sports festival. And so Izuku would text All Might as we would flash back to the sports festival after Izuku would have taken down Todoroki in the Calvary battle. All Might explaining him the truth about One for All and how he was the successor of Nana Shimura, how he had been injured in a final battle against the demon lord of all evil villains. And with Izuku hearing all this and knowing that he has his own quirk to boot, Izuku would have denied this offer, All Might telling him that he would keep the quirk for a bit in case Izuku would change his mind, with All Might thinking that maybe it was time to pass it to someone else. But just as All Might was actually planning to do that in about a week, Izuku would message him as we, obviously now go back to the future, and he would be granted the quirk of One for All, with Izuku's power growing exponentially. This would help Izuku get incredible speed and strength, and would not only enhance his quirk, but multiply it. It would become 10 times stronger than it was before, making it way more difficult to control, with Izuku once again being back at a state where he has to train on his quirk to even get a grasp on his power. So with Izuku doing that and the heroes all preparing for the worst case scenario, eventually they would end up getting word about the doctor who was responsible for the nomification process. So making their grand attack on that hospital much like they do in canon, they would all face resistance, and not only the Nomus this time, but All for One, as we would have Izuku officially meeting the Lord of all evil and going face to face with him. A massive thunderbolt would be shot inside of the area, which All for One, using the quirk Rewind, would seemingly return from the dead from, telling Izuku that while he is an incredible fighter, and if he didn't have a successor, he would have found himself in a horrible situation. Unfortunately for him, Shigaraki is ready. It's in this moment that it would be revealed that Izuku's lightning strike had horrible ramifications, because it had been the spark that Shigaraki had needed to wake up. So once Shigaraki would rise to his feet, he would place his feet on the ground, decaying everything. This would kill countless heroes, Aizawa being included in the mix, with Izuku watching a devastating event take place before his eyes, all the while All for One would cackle and Shigaraki would say, "Hello, brother." The All for One and One for All connection finally being something that we would get in the story, with us watching on as Izuku's eyes would glow with a golden lightning hue to them. Izuku would stare towards the direction of Shigaraki, as suddenly that lightning color would then turn white, and Izuku staring at the two villains that had seemingly just destroyed everything for him, including the literal building that they were inside. Izuku would then proceed to start channeling a storm so massive that it was double the size of the biggest storm that we have ever seen in the real life world, with Izuku raining down so much, and I mean it, so much water on the area, it would genuinely flood. And in one fell swoop, Izuku charging all the embers of electricity that he has within himself, he would pulverize All for One and Shigaraki, whose regeneration would attempt to heal him, but his cells would be destroyed faster than new ones can be created, meaning that not only would Izuku defeat All for One in this moment, but the newly awakened Shigaraki as well. With that happening, suddenly the sky would clear, as Izuku's eyes would go back to their natural hue, and he would lift his hands, causing all those little droplets of water to return back to the sky. As Izuku would sit there, he would look onwards towards the devastation and destruction that it had taken for the two crime bosses to have finally been taken out. And with that being the case, Izuku would start to stumble, him falling over, before being awoken in the hospital, where Izuku, once there, would be told about everything that had taken place, and an unfortunate event that had also taken place once All for One was defeated. A video had actually leaked where the true story of Bakugo had gone viral, why he had become a villain, and the hatred stored in his heart towards Izuku. This would completely tarnish Izuku's reputation, with Izuku, once he would be kind of, not really that healed, making a public statement saying that everything that Bakugo had said in that video was true, sort of kind of falling into that Endeavor road where some skeletons in his closet would come to light, with him going on to pretty much say that if the people would accept him, he was willing to live out all of his days as a servant of the people, helping the world make a difference for two, seeing as he knows Bakugo would have made an incredible hero if he was still around. Some people would view Izuku as much of a hero as Bakugo, as much of a villain as Bakugo was, with others saying that Izuku was not responsible for the actions of somebody with bitter jealousy. Yeah, the boy must have taken things a bit too far in their fight, but the truth was that every villainous action Bakugo took was of his own accord, so if anybody needs to suffer the consequences, it was him, and seeing as he was dead now, there was nobody that deserved any backlash or blame. This would eventually lead to Izuku becoming a hero after a few years of attending Shiketsu High, eventually going on to become the #1 hero in Japan.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video! Like it or die!
That wasn't the line, Kachan!
Whatever!